Thanks everyone as you're finding your seats. We've got a brilliant panel coming up next, panel number 2, around models for sustainable feminist advocacy. And I can't think of a more timely conversation to be having about how we sustain ourselves and our movement in changing times. As Helen was speaking, the feminist movement, change is an inevitable part. But thinking about how we make those changes in sustainable ways for ourselves, for our movements, for our ideas, and for those coming up behind us is so critical. Leading this panel, or moderating this panel, is the wonderful Kit McMahon, who's the CEO of Women's Health in the South East and also connected to WAVE. Kit has implemented gender equality plans in TAFE, local government and tourism, and skills policy. With over 20 years of experience in not-for-profits and a background in skills and training policy, Kit is uniquely well placed to facilitate this conversation. Please join me in making our panel very welcome.
Yay, thank you. I don't recognise the person in that bio. I'm still trying to work out what I want to do when I grow up. Hi everyone, my name's Kit and welcome to this panel on the elephant in the room, sustainable feminist advocacy. I want to attest and state here that I have benefited from the colonisation of these lands and want to acknowledge First Nations people. I was privileged to be born and raised on Gutjamara lands, was educated in Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, had my children on Gadigal in Eora Nation, and now I live and work on Bunurong lands. So I want to pay my respects to the elders of all those nations and just say that sovereignty was never ceded. I think we might go the first slide, if we may, Maestro. So we want to acknowledge that some of the things that we're probably going to talk about today are a bit personal for many of us. So I just invite you to ground yourself, and wherever you're at with your feet on the floor, this is a beautiful image of the Aurora Australis that was shared by Caro. And, you know, it's a vast, vast image that reminds us that we have a place in the larger universe, don't we? And that we do have infinite possibilities before us when at times maybe we don't. But I want to recognise that the weight of the work we're here to discuss. And we're honestly here to talk about some hard truths about feminist advocacy. The first truth is the work is challenging and it doesn't get any easier unless we fully embrace its difficulty. And we're often encouraged, aren't we, to gloss over struggles, to focus solely on progress. But the truth is that the path to real solutions actually begins with honest acknowledgement of obstacles that we face, individually and together. The second truth is that our work is cyclical. And I think I'm not alone in saying that often at times we feel ourselves revisiting the same issues and fighting similar battles. And it can be incredibly frustrating, but it's also an opportunity to go deeper and to understand and strengthen our understanding and develop more effective strategies. So our hope is today is that we can hold this space long enough at this moment in time to look deep enough and hold the friction and the frustration and perhaps even notice some creative tension. But, you know, it won't be easy. The women that I'm privileged to sit on here today have stepped into this space and thought deeply about how they can make the best use of this moment that ERA has given us. So it might get a bit heavy, but also I know it will be illuminating and we will discover our strengths. So let's breathe together and ground ourselves in that reality. You have the bios in front of you of the women people you're about to hear. The goal is to create a conversation, but I'm just going to invite you to introduce yourself how you'd like to be introduced and any acknowledgements you'd like to make at this moment. So, Elena, do you want me to start with you? Chandri, sorry.
Oh, it's on. Lovely to meet you all. I'm Chandni, for those who I haven't met yet. I don't really know what I want to say about myself. My bio is probably long and boring. The most interesting things to know in addition to that is I've just moved back to Australia after several years abroad in Geneva, and I just want to say what a breath of fresh air it is to sit here with you all today and to be in a room full of connection and common values and energy, and I really, really appreciate you giving us your time and being here with you all, so thank you.
Sienna.
Hi everyone, my name's Sienna, my pronouns are she, her. I am currently the Senior Project Officer at Australian Women's Health Alliance, and normally I am all virtual with the Zoom version of me. So it's so lovely to see people here in person, and also for those on Zoom. It's great to be able to create this space together. But yeah, I'm normally doing my work, living and playing on the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people in southeast Queensland. So yeah, I'm really lucky and excited to be here today as well in Naam. Anything else about me? I guess one thing that I really value about these spaces is we never seem to have enough time for it. So yeah, I'm just myself, like, thank you for that introduction to breathe and ground ourselves, because there's always work to do. And so I think part of this work is actually sitting, reflecting, getting present to the contributions we all make. And yeah, just slow our pace down a little to the pace that we want to choose. So yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Caroline Lambert. I'd like to acknowledge that this land is the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and this is where I work and where I live. And I'm the daughter of migrants who have a deep history in the colonial past of England and empire, and finding the way to work with colleagues to pull apart those structures of power and privilege is a really important part of what I do. And I love the work that I do with feminists here and around the world. That'll do.
Thank you. Elena. I think they just magically come on.
Let's see. Thanks, Kit, and thanks so much for having me. My name is Elena Rosenman, and I am the CEO of the Women's Legal Centre in Canberra, and in my spare time I'm the chair of the national peak body for Women's Legal Services in Australia, Women's Legal Services Australia, who are a member of ERA. I have flown here this morning from Ngunnawal and Ngambri, where I live in Canberra, and very happy to be on the panel today.
So we're hoping to establish a conversation, and I don't know about you, but I always feel a bit of a fraud up high, lit, on palatial chairs. It's a bit patriarchal, this conference bit, isn't it? But the real content's here, isn't it? The real content is in the room. So we'll start with the panel and we'll see where it goes, yeah? Okay. So Caro, one of the things I love listening to you talk about is you often refer to epoch change. Yeah? Can I ask, for me, if you can explain it to me again, and maybe anyone else who's interested, and how actually does this shape this work that we're doing?
Thanks, Kitty. I done the glasses change. So you're all blurry now, but the words in front of me are clear. And I also just wanted to say strap in, just because there's some really big ideas in here, and if that sort of thing blows your mind, don't listen when I'm talking about that. And I've got some slides also, so that you don't have to carry everything in your head. So, and I'm just going to look at the Aurora Australis over Antarctica again with the Milky Way, because I spent 11 years working for the YWCA, which is a Christian organisation in some parts of the world. And so we often talked about the 2,000-year timeline in which patriarchy operated in that context, and how this is the work that is intergenerational, and that we stand on the shoulders of those who come before us and we create the pathways for those who come after us. But epoch change. So when I talk about this idea, I draw directly from the work of the Dark Matter Labs, led by Indy Johar, who is my absolute intellectual crush. And he talks about this time we are living through as one of epochal change. And by this, Johar means that we are in a moment of huge transition, as one set of systems associated with the industrial age are replaced by another associated with the digital age, which is made even more challenging by the unmitigated climate disaster in part birthed by the industrial age, but also by patriarchy, colonialisation, white supremacy, capitalism. I'm going to come back to the nature of this transition in a moment, but first, what are the headlines of what this means for a sustainable feminist advocacy? And if we could move away from the Aurora, sorry.
3 slides on, my friend. There we go. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that the opportunity, headlines. The opportunities and challenges of the digital age require us to embrace individual and collective energy, to bring our individual and collective energy to 6 key areas. We need to embrace the new knowledges that are evolving. We need to increase our power literacy and forensically track the loci of new power and reframe our work accordingly. We need to collectivise our learning and turn that learning into strategy within our organisations, and this is the vital bit, across movements. We need to grow our intersectional analysis and practice. And as an older feminist, I am taught daily by younger feminist colleagues what it looks like to do that innately. We need to draw deeply on reciprocity, compassion, and the power of power with. And we need to evolve our practices of collective care to nurture resilience and resistance in the face of strident opposition, 17%, to our cause. So if I could have the next slide, the too long didn't read version. Ooh, that might not be so evident on the background there, is that to sustain feminist advocacy, we need to harness intersectional feminist leadership to embrace new knowledge, become more power savvy, build cultures of learning, and turn organisational learnings into collectivised strategies across movements. And in doing so, I hope we will be helping to birth the new systems. We will be part of the epochal change. But to return briefly to Kitty's question on what I mean by epochal change and how it shapes the work of feminist advocacy, we tend to speak of epochal change, usually a long period of intense change, as if it's quite rare, when in actual fact the history of this planet has epochal change in abundance. And that's important because while the ideas and practices of epochal change are big and overwhelming, and there are invariably appalling harms associated with the change, and sometimes they just cannot be got over, these moments can also be periods of creativity, opportunity, and transformation. As with everything, context is key. So, for example, many moons and moons and moons ago, an asteroid hit the area we now know as the Yucatan Peninsula, and earthbound dinosaurs became extinct. Flying dinosaurs, who had already started to evolve into birds, survived. I digress. In the wake of the asteroid impact, and over a period of 700,000 years, vegetation and fauna the diversification of vegetation and fauna intensified. And just as a sidebar, so even if we humans drive mass extinction, perhaps most usually from the critters and creatures' perspectives, it would be human extinction, I hope that at some point the Earth will regenerate without us. And hope is an important act of resistance in a time of epochal change. In the more recent past, between 1760 and 1840, European countries transitioned from the agricultural age to the industrial age, with its focus on large-scale manufacturing, created fundamental changes, including to the organisation of labour and capital, and with that, shifts in social norms around gender roles, to new legal schemes to protect property and the expansion of property to include knowledge, and a shift from stewarding nature to controlling and exploiting nature, all of which went hand in hand with European invasion and colonisation, which peaked just before the so-called First World War, when European countries had invaded and colonised, decimated 84% of the landmass of this globe. And right now, we are in another moment of transition from the industrial age to the digital or knowledge age. And once again, everything is up in the air. At one level, these epochal shifts are deeply unsettling. Our legal, economic, political and cultural systems are no longer fit for purpose. And there are huge power transitions underway as new actors arise and old actors are displaced. New systems are created and old systems are discarded. You need only think of newspaper headlines around the tech bros gambling that money they'll accumulate will protect them from the harms of releasing inadequately tested artificial intelligence systems into a regulatory and ethical landscape that is scrambling to catch up. Could we get the next slide? Or you could superimpose a map of Elon Musk's Starlight satellites, that's on the left and the right, on the Milky Way, or, less poetically, just technically, the atmosphere above us. And think about the parallels between Musk's colonisation of space and the East India Company's colonisation of Asia and Southeast Asia, including the fact that their armed forces were twice the size of the British Army. It becomes very easy to see why these shifts are unsettling. Perhaps unsurprisingly, these moments of great change give rise to periods of fear-based politics. Stop the boats, if you don't know, vote no, perpetuating a them and us mentality, the so-called gender and cultural wars that result in protests against drag queen story time, and opposition to new technologies. And I'm curious to see what form the Luddite protests, the destruction of new technologies during the Industrial Revolution, will take in the digital age. But this notion of fear is based in the fight, flight or freeze paradigm, the first of which I would argue is deeply associated with patriarchal ways of being in the world. Another response to fear is found in tend and befriend, and the panel before us spoke to that so powerfully. Historically, tend and befriend has taken longer to kick in. For example, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing before its complicated evolution of anti-poverty work by capitalists who benefited from slavery and colonial expropriation, but also who evolved new forms of worker benefits which were influential in the foundation of the modern welfare state. That was an example of tend and befriend. And it is with this idea of tend and befriend that I want to return to the question of what is required to support sustainable feminist activism. I talked about embracing opportunities for new knowledge and ways of understanding. I'm curious, for example, to consider what advances in neuroscience, that the neural pathways in our brains are far more malleable across our lifespan than we thought, and what that might mean for gender and feminist activism. This is particularly relevant as we confront the challenges and limits of formal advocacy in a post-truth polarising world. The conjunct of neuroscience and feminism has the potential to generate new insights into how individual consciousness and social norms are formed and reformed in the minds of advocates and opponents of gender equality and in the minds of the decision makers in the policy realm. And of course, it wouldn't be 2024 if you didn't also talk about how can we harness AI constructively for feminist activism while also mitigating the immense damage of biases in AI. I also flagged the importance of forensically tracking the loci of new power. And so what are the new sites and forms of power over that are framing our lives, and how are we building our knowledge, tools and relationships to influence them? And just to flag that in this power section, I'm drawing on the work of Srilata Batliwala, that in the pre-reading that you may or may not have done, the All About Power primer can give you further insights. It's awesome. So what are the new sites and forms of power over that are framing our lives, and how are we building our knowledge, tools and relationships to influence them? How, for example, do you seek to influence the mechanisms of anarchist cryptocurrencies and address what they mean to the legitimacy of the state, including its anti-discrimination frameworks? What comes next for global governance, including the non-binding human rights treaties, when the UN has failed so spectacularly in the face of climate change and conflict? It's also important to think about the possibilities of power with, the opportunities which arise from the new forms of collective activism directed at the ruptures in systems, and harnessing, for example, the intersections of culture and activism. And in that context, how do we maintain the power of collective activism in the digital age with the advent of hyper-individualised, consumption-based influencer activism? The loci of new power also requires us to look within and evolve a more sophisticated understanding of the impact of power under within our own feminist movements. Power under is psychoanalyst Steve Weinman's explanation of why people who have experienced the harm of power often become abusive, authoritarian and oppressive themselves when they gain power. He links unhealed anger and the helplessness of powerless rage to the inability to hold and exercise power in healthy ways, ways that don't put down or manipulate other people. And so it is critical for our sustainability as humans and activists that we get better at recognising our own power patterns and working for individual as well as structural transformation of power. And this asks us to draw deeply from practices of reciprocity, the relationality that the climate panel talked about so clearly. Compassion for ourselves, for our allies, controversially for our opposition, shifting from the relentless noise of self-righteous, individualised outrage and entitlement to a transformative compassion, a heart-shaped anger that finds expression in power with. Finally, I promise finally, it is absolutely imperative that we collectivise and evolve our learning into strategy. This means strengthening our feminist monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning muscles by putting the folks we work with at the heart of our, as they call it, meal systems. And I'm just going to digress because I'm doing a global project on feminist meal at the moment, and we're using AI sometimes for our translation, and so it comes across as a feminist meal, repast in French, and I get hungry at that point. Anyway, I digressed. Oh my God. This means strengthening our feminist meal muscles by putting the folks we work with at the heart of our meal systems. By reframing expertise to focus on lived experience, by ensuring that the people who tell their stories get a say in how those stories are interpreted and used, and that they own those stories, by interrogating the power relationships across all steps of the process, by focusing on accountability to movements, not donors, and by building organisational cultures that embrace learning and authorise risk with care and learning from failure. And this is a critical step that is too often missed in the meal world, we need to commit to turn this learning into strategy at an organisational level, and here's the challenge for us in the movement, at a movement level. While it can be hard work, every time we sit in these collective sites of learning and strategy, we have the opportunity to build our resistance and resilience to the forces that oppose us. It's a profoundly challenging call to action in a time of competitive tendering and brand feminism. But it is fundamental to securing the sustainability of our feminist activism. And as I said at the outset, it is that my hope that this will power us to be a positive part of the process of epochal change.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lambert. I think we're now going to turn to the lived experience of our colleagues on the panel now, and embracing new knowledge and ways of understanding, tracking the new sites of power, and how to build our knowledge on these, the look within, the look for the power under, how is this translating it into the way that we work, so we work well, not unhealthy, to strengthen our feminist meal. Yeah? So thank you so much for putting the thought into that, and I know everyone's put thought into this moment. But I'm wondering now, with those words ringing in our ears, Elena, if I can come to you. And when we were preparing for this, you were sharing and disclosing some really powerful narratives about the way I think what Cara was talking about translates to your world and your lived experience with your members. So you're in the thick of it and you're seeing this up close, yeah? The issues around sustainable feminist advocacy. The balance of telling truth to power and wanting the funding from that power that you tell the truth to. So I'm just wondering what parallels you would draw around the interpersonal power dynamics, maybe that Cara referred to, and also institutional relationships that emerge when we try to do the feminist work.
Thanks, Kit. I can promise that I am not going to quote any dark matter theorists, but I did think it might be worth just introducing a little bit more about where I come from, just because probably quite unexpectedly, and I'd say it's a pretty rare experience for me. I walked into this room and I was like, oh, there's no one I know here. I said yes to this panel, probably like most people, because it was Helen that asked me. And I think the fact that I don't know people and have this conversation is probably the not too long didn't read version of what I'm going to say and what the future might look like for feminist advocacy. So very briefly, as I said, I'm the chair of Women's Legal Services Australia. So Women's Legal Services Australia is the peak body for the 13 specialist women's legal services. There are women's legal services in every jurisdiction. There are multiple services in some of the bigger jurisdictions, and 2 jurisdictions that also have community-controlled women's legal services in them. That network of services supports about 25,000 women every year, and probably at least double or triple that when we consider accompanying children. My day job, well, all the day jobs, is as the CEO of the Women's Legal Centre in the ACT, which is now quite a large legal centre. We provide free legal assistance to women in relation to domestic and family violence, family breakdown, employment discrimination and sexual harassment, migration and sexual violence. So we have quite a broad service, and we also do that in an integrated model of legal service delivery. So we also have a specialist social work practice that work with us, as well as other professionals from different disciplines that provide support to the women we work with. So I guess I would say that since second wave feminism, which as long as my history goes back, frontline DFVs, or domestic and family violence services, I think have been a key front of the feminist movement, and have also, I think, traditionally provided critical feminist leadership. And of course that is, the very idea of the personal being political is obviously such a tenet of second wave feminism, and also was the observation that led to the development of feminist women's services in the 70s and 80s in Australia. And the network of services that I'm the chair of all identify as feminist services. So while a lot of people will very naturally connect us first and foremost with domestic and family violence or gender-based violence, actually the project of all our services is a broader project, is a project about gender equality. So I have to admit I was a bit bemused to be asked to join this panel, particularly because the idea of, it's hard to think of an idea that is further from my day-to-day experience and those of my colleagues than the ideas of sustainability and advocacy. Both of those, I would say, both of those ideas seem extraordinarily removed from my day-to-day reality in running my organisation and supporting the colleagues across Australia that do the same in all of their jurisdictions. The current context of service delivery in Australia at the moment, I mean, I'm sure there will be women in the room that will say it has ever been thus. This is not a change, but certainly I think post-COVID what we have observed is an escalation in the experience of violence, in the level of risk, a quantifiable escalation in experiences like strangulation and other harbingers of lethal violence. And of course across Australia, many of us were unsurprised to see the recent statistic that there's been a 30% increase in domestic and family violence homicides across Australia in the last 12 months. So I think we've seen that that escalation combined with a diminution of support and community, and lots of those ideas I think are linked to what Caro was talking about. The other thing that makes feminist leadership in my space very difficult is what that has also led to is a diminution in the capacity for advocacy and critical thought and systemic voice from our sector into the conversation. And so I'd say the peak body arrangements are, and I know this is very germane to the conversations that will continue to happen this week, but the peak body arrangements in our space are better or worse across each jurisdiction, and I'm conscious that I'm in Victoria, which is traditionally a better performer than some of the others. But nationally, we haven't seen yet anyone be able to actually put a coherent national position in relation to domestic and family violence and gender-based violence. And my observation would say that it is very interesting for me to reflect on the structure, particularly of the alliance model, and how that has, I think, in many ways acted as an inhibitor for that connection across movements. So actually the fact, I mean, I was one of the people that put my hand up when Victoria asked who has had the first conversation they've had today about the intersection of climate change with their work. And I mean, I've had conversations, but it was the first time I'd probably been asked that question and thought about it. And actually, I think that those connections have been inhibited by the diminution, I think, of the amount of time and resources we have to advocacy and critical thought in our space. I also observe the lack of, or the difficulty of creating an intersectional critique of the systems that perpetuate gender-based violence. So the sector I work in is still pretty white, and certainly we observe it is hard. We have a very, in this organisation I run, we have a very diverse group of colleagues at the more junior levels, but we find the more senior the positions we attempt to recruit. Many women of colour, many First Nations women, many women with disability have already read themselves out of the sector that we work in, and so that our analysis is impoverished by that as well. But overall, I would say when I think about and this is not very cheery, but the greatest cause of exhaustion, and I would say when I look around my colleagues, when I look at the other CEOs of feminist services, both in Canberra and nationally, there are a few things. The first is the funding models of scarcity and competition have absolutely eroded relationships between us and the willingness to collaborate and back each other. And every day I run an ethical dilemma because I know that my success is improved by the diminution of other services in my space, and that is a deep personal ethical challenge for me. I think the other thing more recently is the cognitive dissonance between what politicians from all sides of government and at all levels of government are prepared to say about gender-based violence versus what they are prepared to fund. And certainly at Women's Legal Service Australia, we found ourselves quite caught off guard by the recent federal budget, where there was no funding for legal services and no funding for frontline services, and we hadn't even prepped a media release for that eventuality. Across Australia, we turn away 52,000 women every year. So for every one woman we assist, we're turning away two. So I think the other reason that is so exhausting is the moral injury that I observe among our colleagues of the reality of that. And I guess to go lastly to your question, the other sort of thing that I find probably the most exhausting and difficult in my work is the parallel process between the client work we do and the relationships we have with funders. So I would say at the very best, our funders have a benign, ineffectual relationship with us. And at the very worst, I have said before that a lot of what I know about coercive control and financial control stems from the relationships I and many of my colleagues find ourselves in with the funders that we work with. And I think that is at worst. It's not all the time, but I would say the single most exhausting part of my job, which is also as a woman, is having to navigate the complexity of, well, my obligation, as I understand it, to provide independent, forthright, clear advocacy with the absolute survival skill of staying liked and appealable and pleasant, so that I am one of the people they choose when they are handing out funding.
There you go. I think we'll just leave now, Helen. How's that? Thank you. Yeah. So thank you. And before I go on to Chandni and Sienna, I just want to connect, Cara's talking about the elements of hope, of embracing new knowledges, of tracking the sites of power, of looking within. I'm hearing you describe an environment that is completely counter to that the funding models of scarcity and competition prevent you from finding the new knowledge. The reduction of connections and collaboration results in less ability to be able to track power and advocate against it. And in fact, it leads to, lacks of intersectional knowledge in leadership, which impoverishes us, and this sense of the ethical dilemma that the sector is consistently placed in, and the moral injury that is compounded over time, and the parallel between the way funding works and I would say the systemic impact of that in that moral injury. Thank you. That is a heavy thing to hold, but I feel the resonance in the room. We're with you, yeah? And I think at this time when we're in this room and we're with each other, Chandni, I might turn to you, because maybe at this point, you've worked globally, you've worked in so many different lands with so many, IWDA does this so well. So, in light of this, in light of political polarisation, in light of the story that's been shared and the epochal challenges presented, I guess, how do we build, in your experience, how do we build resilient feminist movements? Let's just start to think about what we can do. Just fix that for us. Helen wants us to solve it before we leave, so.
No pressure. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Elena. Thank you for sharing that quite vulnerably and openly, because it's a critical insight into what the sector is facing, but it's also a very personal insight, which I heard the resonance of and I feel the heaviness of. So thank you for being vulnerable with us. And I just want to start by saying, and I hope this is not adding to the doom and gloom, but but we're not alone. I think a lot of what Elena is saying is specific to Australia, if I'm understanding her correctly, and the polarisation that we're referring to is not just national, it's global. It's happening across regions, it's happening with governments around the world, and that tightening is familiar. And not only is it familiar now, it's been familiar for a very long time. And so this backswing that we're seeing to feminism, to decolonisation, particularly against the backdrop of Gaza and other polarising political circumstances, it's not new, and that actually means that we have a lot to learn. I think that being in Australia is often geographically isolating, and that also means we have less footfall from people that we can borrow from. And so when we think about feminist movements and resilience and the adaptability and the creativity, we can look to so many places for inspiration. So I want to try and break this heaviness and bring us to some new spaces. So yes, as I said, the question is not what we can do, just us, it's what we can learn. So first and foremost, I think that in any crisis, and I do think we are in a crisis with domestic violence rates increasing up to 30%, as you said, we need to go back to fundamental values. I think that's true in any crisis. And so I know there are a lot of people in this room entrenched in the feminist movement, but I also know there are a lot of people who are new to the space and the jargon, and there's a lot of jargon, that we love jargon here. So I want to take us back to the values that I think we can lean on before we go any further. First of all, feminism, as most of you will know, is not just women's rights. We're not just talking about gender equality, we're talking about shifting power, right? And that's bigger. And that is talking about inequality in the dynamics that we have created as a society. You know, if you're born in a particular way, it's not the way you were born that creates inequality, it's our perception and our treatment of people that creates that. So we're talking about shifting power, first of all. We're talking about intersectionality, which Dr. Anna Cody spoke about so beautifully, and I'm so glad she explained it so I don't have to. But we're talking about intersectional approaches and being open-minded and aware of everyone's different experience of the world. We're talking about processes, not just outputs, remembering that productivity is a very patriarchal concept, and so your care, your process, the way you do things, it matters. And we're talking about the centrality of care and connection, which are also often been removed from us in the process of, leaning into patriarchy, leaning into productivity and capitalism. So they're just some of the fundamental values I want us to keep in the back of our minds, or I invite you to keep in the back of your minds. And I want to take us to another fundamental, which is, what are feminist movements, right? We talk about them as if we know what they are. They're this vague, amorphous thing, but there are actually specific factors which help us to identify what it is that we're doing here and what it is that we're looking for when we want to learn, right? We're talking about movements that have a connection to constituency, which means they are led by people who experience the structural inequalities that we're talking about, number one. Number two is they're diverse and they leverage their diversity as a strength. Number three is that they co-develop, so everyone's talking about an intersectional feminist analysis of what the issue is and where we're going. So we're looking for people who are talking to each other and trying to work things out together. They centralize trust, they invest in relationships, and there's a common vision for the change that we want to see, and we're working towards it collaboratively. So we're not just talking about movements, we're talking about movements that are really working together in concrete ways. And the reason that I'm listing these factors is that the existence of these movements has been proven to be the most significant factor positively impacting a country's policy responses to violence against women. And that's important for us, right? Okay, let me tell you about this study. So this finding was a robust analysis of 70 countries over 4 decades done by Thun and Weldon. And they found that a strong feminist movement was more important than all other factors they considered. That includes the participation of women in politics, left-leaning political parties, and the country's wealth. So even if it feels bleak, the situation we're in, the fact that we are in a feminist movement and we are moving towards a common vision for change, we are doing a lot. And so in nurturing this movement, in nurturing what we have in this room, we are impacting and growing one of the most significant factors that can influence policy change in a country. Knowing this, I'm going to talk about two things, none of which are the things that Caro so eloquently listed in her list of 6 things to consider. I want to talk about what I'm imagining as kind of, the snowball effect. So when I think about a movement, I think about someone pushing a little snowball off the top of a snowy mountain, and as it falls, it's growing and it's growing and it's picking up more snow as it goes. So that's what I'm imagining. And when I think about resilience, I think about 2 places. I think about, is the inside of the snowball strong enough so that when it picks up ramps and it bounces, it's not going to fall apart? And is there enough snow for it to keep growing? Right. So the way I interpret that is, what can we do to strengthen our feminist movements from the inside? And then what does sustainability mean in this funding crisis that we're in? Strengthening our feminist movement from the inside. I want to take us to an article I read recently by Susanna at the Urgent Action Fund Asia Pacific. And I'm sorry, Susanna, I can't remember her last name because I consider her a friend. So, but she had this beautiful way of summing up what the inside of the snowball means to me. The individual informs the collective. It forms the collective, and the collective forms the culture. So when I think about the inside of this snowball, what I'm thinking about is every single individual member of a feminist movement and how they feel, what they do, how they wake up in the morning, what keeps them going. So my first thing I want to say when it comes to strengthening the resilience of feminist movements is listen to your body. It sounds so overdone, I know that, but listen to your body, trust your wisdom. I know that knowledge is a very powerful thing, and it's a thing that a lot of people will point to. There's patriarchy that always wants evidence. We are taught to have to justify our wants and our needs. Trust your wisdom, trust your body, and do not lose your confidence, because everyone is telling us right now that we are wrong for asking for more, and we're not. And confidence is a thing that takes us through, because we know the data shows us all of the things. It backs us up every time. Don't lose confidence. That's the first thing. The next thing is persistence, which I know we all know, so I won't go down there. And the others are the centrality of care and connection. The amount of people today who I've spoken to who've said, oh, I can't tell you how good it is to be in this room and to be with everyone face to face and to feel so energized by the fact that we all just get it. That's the stuff that keeps us resilient. That's the stuff that reminds us we're not alone and we're part of a movement. And I know a lot of these things sound basic, but they sound basic because we often forget them. And so this reminder is, I feel, important. The next things are kind of connected to what you were saying, Elena. It's embracing the ecosystem and leaning into collaboration and supporting each other, championing each other. And I know that is a conundrum, and it's one that I have faced before as well, and we have faced in previous workplaces, is how we champion each other when we know we're inherently in competition for the same resources. But I do think there are ways to do that. Any of us who've been in feminist collectives know there are ways that we can work together through open and honest communication, like radically looking down the barrel of the gun and airing things as we go, and still supporting and championing our work as we stand side by side and know that, if I'm not the right person for that funding, then someone else was, and it's still contributing to this ecosystem and leaning back on that concept of a movement. The last 2 things I'll say on this is to talk about shifting power now more than ever. And that's coming back to that basic value that I mentioned before, is that, there's a lot of confusion, especially in Australia, but, when we use the word feminism, I still hear people talk about feminine politics. I still hear people talk about women's rights, and it's so interchangeably used when really we know that the principles that back feminism are a bit more specific than that. So talk about those. And the last thing I'll say is lean into the regional feminist movement that we have, not just the national one, because the issues that we are beginning to experience more and more, for example, climate change. Thank you for that incredible panel before lunch, everyone. who was on it. But our experience of climate change is not specific to Australia. We're part of a region that's experiencing really similar things. And so when we think about what it is that we want to learn, how we want to tackle it, let's look to our neighbours and lean into, where we are. Enough about the inside of the snowball. More sustainable funding opportunities. Okay, look, let's acknowledge there's lots of disappointment in the tightening of government funding, but it doesn't look like that's going to change. It's not going to become more reliable, and let's be real, nor was it necessarily ideal to begin with, right? The funding arrangements that we had their limitations, both in size, both in scope, in the timeframes, structurally. So I would like to invite you to see the opportunity in this to work on our baseline and to find other sources of funding that might provide more beneficial structures and arrangements. And that sounds crazy because we've just talked about the global polarisation and the tightening and the conservatism, but I would like to introduce an opportunity that's come onto my radar only in the last year, which is the significant juncture we're at when it comes to philanthropy as a source of funding. So in this exact moment, in Australian philanthropy, $2.6 trillion is about to be passed to the next generation in Australia. So that's by 2040. The majority of the people who will receive that wealth will be women. Philanthropic giving is set to double by 2030, and that's supported by the Australian government. And the total wealth of Australia's wealthiest has nearly tripled between 2015 and 2021. So that means there's more money. Lots of it's being passed down to women who are maybe more interested in giving to gender equality related causes, and it's growing. Moreover, there are trailblazing philanthropists who are embracing the kinds of funding that we're looking for. Core funding, trust-based funding, flexible funding that is agile and that enables us to meet quickly and rapidly changing needs. So this is a critical moment for us to keep having conversations about the principles of gender transformative giving, feminist funding, whatever you want to call it, best practice principles, because this is our moment to strengthen our baseline and to lean into a sense of momentum that we can create together. This junction that I've just outlined is a key part of my current work with the Resourceful Collective. So I didn't give myself a very good introduction earlier, but I'm Chandni Dhingra. I noticed I didn't say my last name and I was reflecting on it because I have an uncommon first name, and so I often sell myself short because I just assume there are no other Chandnis, but I can take up some space. I can do that. I'm currently working as the Activating Feminist Philanthropy consultant with IWDA, but even though I'm housed at IWDA, International Women's Development Agency, I'm a collective resource. So I work with the Urgent Action Fund Asia Pacific, the Pacific Feminist Fund and IWDA together, looking at this moment in Australian philanthropy and trying to expand the community of Australian philanthropists who are practicing feminist values and who are supporting resourcing feminist movements in our region. And when I say region, I include the Pacific in that. Previously the Feminist Movement Strengthening Advisor with IWDA, just because I sold myself short earlier, and I've just moved back from Geneva where I was with the ICRC and the Human Rights Watch. So my background is human rights and humanitarian law, policy, advocacy, so on. So anyway, Resourceful. This amazing collective is working with philanthropy to try and expand the community of philanthropists who are familiar with these values. And I'm just going to give us a shameless spruik because we're about to publish a set of principles which we have tried to make accessible to audiences who may be less jargon friendly, who may not know the jargon that we often use in our circles. And the principles really try to break down what we're talking about here today. They try to break down what a funder can do to proactively apply a power-shifting lens across all aspects of the funding process, like Cara mentioned. So that includes who they're giving to, where the money is going, how it's given, and importantly, how they can do relationships with their funding partners, the reflection practice on their own power, and literally the how of how to have the conversations, what to do to move that. And we came to these principles by reflecting on practices held by feminist movements broadly, And then we tested them in a series of curated conversations, we like to call them, with small groups of leaders in Australian feminist philanthropy, with gender equality advocates, and with leaders of the Pacific feminist movements, because we really did want these to be regionally endorsed. And then we refined them. So I won't list the principles themselves because there are many, but they embody the conversations that we're having today. The centrality of trust and genuine relationships in a funding relationship, the need for core, flexible, long-term funding. So organisations and all of us can get out of survival mode and we can be, not just do. And we can be more and do more from a place of better well-being and health and sustainability. The importance of collaboration and the importance of reflecting and acting on power imbalance as part of your practice. As I said, we've tried to make them practical and accessible for a range of audiences, and I'm happy to talk about them more if anyone's interested. But I think this is the moment where I wrap up because I'm just noticing the time. But the point is, talk about power shifting now more than ever. Lean on the movement. Phone a friend. I think that's one of the tests of a feminist movement and how strong it is. If you can pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm having this issue. Can we just talk about it? Can we go through it together? Prioritise your care and trust your body, like I said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, you know, we come to this within the context that Caroline presented to us. We heard firsthand about the tensions that are there to be a feminist movement at a time of capitalisation, high competition, the moral injury. But we're moving towards thinking, well, how do we address that? And it's in the values, looking after your body, but the opportunities that are emerging about how to do what Caro started, which is find the new tracking sources of power, but also build new knowledge as well. So you're talking about a new knowledge, about a new way to be resilient. And I was struck there about how the centrality of relationships and collaboration with philanthropy that you're doing as well leads me on to Sienna's question, which is just about how we can go about in what I would describe as a world of high political polarisation to develop these relationships that our colleagues are talking about and need.
Thank you.
Just
a little bit. But just in terms of listening to our body, if you do need to stretch, if you're online or in your seat, because I think our bodies are processing a lot of big stuff today. And I guess how do we build those relationships in times of individualization and polarization? I mean, for me, I just had to shake myself and remind myself, you know, the energy in the room that I was experiencing today was like the magic was in the informal conversations, like during lunch. So, so for those of us who are in the room, like hands up, you know, if there was at least one person that you saw today that you haven't seen in a while and you were really happy to see them. So the people on Zoom you can't see, but that was pretty much everyone in the room put their hands up. And I think for me, like everything that's been spoken about, I was like, what do I talk about? Because everything is relationships,
I'm
right?
hearing that too.
Change happens through relationships, how we relate to each other, how we relate to power, how we relate to funders and things like that. How we relate to ourselves, what is the power, how do we use power with, but also power within. So that listening to the body is like us using our agency to use our bodies in the way that we want to take action. And I think, I guess a really great example of how I think relationships can be built is when you invest in time, money, space to cultivate those relationships. So, you know, Helen inviting me to speak here, like the quality of speakers, I think, is a reflection of the quality of connections and relationships that have been made. And I am a former Young Women's Advisory Group member, and I wouldn't be sitting here without that door being open, without being able to have the opportunity to build these relationships, both to learn from you all, but also own my space here as well. And it feels like many moons ago now that I was part of YWAG, but I think it's a really important intergenerational conversation that is not only important sort of with sharing learning. So if we're talking about how we can be agile as organizations and movements, like I think the intergenerational piece is really important. Always, so learning from each other, having those mentoring opportunities as well. And even just, I had no idea about advocacy before I literally was working in an office building where Equality Rights Alliance was on Ngunnawal land. And I would not have known that I'd be sitting here today as well, not necessarily wanting to lead from the front, but I think these conversations are best had when we continue them off the stage and you know, in the boardrooms, in the, you know, morning teas, with the people who aren't here today, and also for those that couldn't make it in person for whatever resource constraints, ability, and things like that. Like, I think it's where are the conversations that you are connected with, like what's your ecosystem that you can continue this conversation, and that in itself I think is a really strong resource. So I kind of see like a mycelium network of everyone here. So you may be in the room here today or online. Who is it that you know that you want to talk about what you're learning, what you're getting out of this, how you're taking knowledge, and also applying that intersectional lens, or bringing back things that, yeah, if you weren't talking about climate before, but you're personally passionate about it, how does it relate to your paid or unpaid work? So I think that relationship in practice is around the sharing of ideas, and then the more you can share those ideas with others for a shared purpose, so building that movement, identifying those principles, and even starting to hear those principles, I was like, oh, that's very energizing. And I think a good reminder as well for, I guess, the quality of relationships is when it gets hard, how do we reclaim care, and how do we reclaim that sense of solidarity and collective care, so that we can keep doing that work. And I think coming back to the topic of sustainable feminist advocacy, like for me, I can only sustain myself doing this work if I actually do have space for joy, if I do have space for connection, because for me, we can have those conflicting tensions of everything that exists in this world and more, and we're also all working to build a future where no one's left behind. And shout out to my colleague Catherine Lim from the Equality Institute, you know, because she talks about intersectionality as creating those gender-responsive systems where no one is left behind. And I think the only other thing that I will mention then on that note is how can we mainstream these conversations? Well, we need to have tools and resources, the language and the shared language as well to relate to each other. And I guess that's something that I do in my job as Senior Project Officer at Australian Women's Health Alliance. So we've got a Women's Health Hub supporting policymakers, researchers, professionals in health and social care, or everyone here. You're part of our audience, so please hop on to australianwomenshealth.org. But again, it's like, how do we actually leverage the wisdom that's in this room? Like, you've got papers and publications and things that could be well fit within the Women's Health Hub, and how could we draw on that to then speak to the people we're trying to influence? So that's how relationships work for me.
Thank you. So colleagues, over to you. We've got about 10 minutes left before Helen kicks us off this stage. You've heard, I guess, some context of how do we create sustainable feminist movements. The lived experience coming through in agencies who receive funding, and the impact of, you know, the moral injury, the ethical concerns. But ever was it thus? We've heard about the opportunity to be that snowball, learn about how to strengthen the inner and you know, the new opportunities, I guess, which goes back to those finding the new knowledge. And then just the questions that Sienna's asking, which is, how do we claim care? How do we find the joy, right? So, speed conversation. Turn to the person next to you. What did you take from this conversation? What did you take from this conversation about how to sustain feminist movements? They might be more problems or they might be solutions. Turn to the person next to you, and I'll be asking a couple of shares after this. Go for it. 30 seconds to go. Make it quick.
I think they're basically the same principles. The reason that we're talking about them in the context of philanthropy is simply because of this moment of change, and so there's this sort of fresh ears.
Okay, colleagues, if I may, draw you back. Draw you back. This is when I talk about how I would love a Zoom meeting to just close the rooms off. It's really hard. So, if I may just draw you back to the collective, what I'm really interested is to see, it's really hard, I know. Colleagues, is there anyone that would like to share? Thanks, Helen. Is there anyone that would like to share something about what resonated just around that subject of how we create those sustainable feminist advocacy? Yeah, just very briefly so we can try to get as many in. Stand up and just say your name very briefly. Thank you.
Meneka Aingar.
Hey.
I think what I got, and I think from Eleanor and from Sienna and others, that we fight for funding. And I think as Eleanor pointed out, sometimes we are almost embarrassed and we know that we're going to take away funding from somebody else because we are wanting for it. So we come to it from a very a paucity of stuff perspective rather than how can we engage others and work with them.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So maybe being more articulate about the tension in the funding, but actually if you want us to contribute to a feminist movement, how these funding structures impact. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, everyone. Perla Guarneros. I am in the research area of feminism, and my colleague and myself here, we were just discussing, it's about communicating and sharing. What we have found is that when we communicate our research and we talk about our projects, we see a lot of people really interested, men and women, and saying, collegiality and saying like, yes, how we can support you. And it's connecting. And then we come to these type of events and we know people who know much more than us in all different areas. And when we talk and you tell me what you're doing and we just share, it's like, this is all interesting. Let's strengthen all of our projects from our own areas of expertise and keep growing together. So it's connections and communication, I think.
Thank you. And it resonates to what Cara was talking about those principles of the finding the new knowledge and the collective approach of new knowledge and layering it. And the other thing I'm hearing too is just the value of these collective events as well, and the scalability, the moment of scalability that will help. It's almost counter to that resistance point that we often find. Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone? Resistance? Yes, ma'am. Colleague down there.
I kind of just put my hand up without thinking.
Fantastic.
One thing I think is that the value, just building on what you were saying, the value of bringing, having a space like this is that sometimes it's not a very easy one-tick solution to a problem.
100%,
the problem is there's so many different layers to it, and sometimes we know that the more you have consultation, the more you're able to actually identify what the next step is. Maybe the reason we don't know, we feel so hopeless and despair is because we haven't looked at the problem from enough different angles, we haven't shared enough resources. And I was thinking about how Helen said at the beginning, this is really the beginning of a conversation that we're having, a point of reflection. So how can we continue to have dialogue that is inclusive, and how do we also give ourselves the time and the space to have this conversation beyond just what our own projects are, beyond just what our own organizations are doing, beyond funding, because this is really a value that we all hold deep to. It's not something that we're really doing because someone is paying us millions of dollars to do it.
And I think Caro's work that you're doing at the moment around strengthening the feminist meal, and also those principles that Chandni talked about. Thank you. Anyone else?
Magic, is there anyone on Zoom, Helen?
Yes, that's a great one. They're going with Josefa and then someone up the back. Thank you. And I don't know if there's anyone on Zoom.
No, I don't know whether I wanted. Look, I think there are different groupings of organisations here, and there is a difference between the Women's Health, the Australian Women's Health Network, and an organisation like Women's Electoral Lobby, and probably National Foundation of Australian Women and others, which do not seek government funding. And in fact, it's kind of a principle upon which we operate, because once we do, we are constrained in what we can do in advocacy. And that's got to be remembered. On the point of philanthropic organisations, because, I am very long in the tooth. I don't know how much longer before I drop off the branch. But to mix a metaphor, philanthropic organisations, we've looked at the possibility of approaching those. They are looking for bang for their buck and an outcome at the end. IWDA, which I'm a very strong supporter for, has usually got a defined project and an outcome at the end. With an advocacy organisation, there ain't necessarily a visible outcome at the end. There may be some movement in the policy arena, but in the end, there may not be, that tangible thing that they want to hang a story on. Yeah. So I think we need to remember that. I mean, I really valued this session, and I particularly valued the contribution of the Australian Women's Health Network and the IWDA contribution, not because the others weren't terrific, but because they sort of pointed to different aspects of what I think we need to do. And building relationships is important. Competition does not encourage relationships or collaboration. Yeah. And that's what we've got to attack.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time as well, and I want to apologise to the person up the back who put their hand up as well. But I think it's my privilege to say thank you to all of you for listening after the lunch hour and being present. Thank you to everyone online. But most of all, can I just ask everyone to join me to thank our fabulous panellists up here for their time. Thank you. And they'll all be here for the rest of the day, I think. So,
a quick hand for Kit as well, everyone, our moderator. Thank you, Kit.
Thank you very much. And now I'm handing over to Maddie.
While our panellists are leaving the stage, maybe we can all take a moment to take a few breaths after that conversation.